This is Wizzie Brown. I'm a extension program specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and today I'm going to be talking to you about IPM basics for the landscape. So when we're talking about IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. A lot of people think that it is insect pest management, but it's not. Integrated pest management, while you can use that to control insects, you can also apply it to things like weeds or structural pests or mammals or pretty much any type of thing that you want to get rid of. So when we're looking at an integrated pest management program, it is a variety of strategies that you're going to utilize to manage the pests that you want to control. So it does require knowledge, which is why you're attending trainings such as this one. And when you're looking at IPM programs, you need to make sure that you have knowledge of both the pests that you find in the location, but also the beneficials. And you're also going to probably need some information about the plants because a lot of insects are going to be either on particular plants or particular groups of plants. And it also helps to know the plant requirements because when we're dealing with plants, a lot of times they are going to need specific things to thrive. And if they're not thriving, then they can be more, I guess, conducive to actually getting insect pest problems. And then the last part of knowledge that you're going to require are different control strategies, which we will be covering those as well today. When you're using an IPM program, it does not mean that you're going to have zero pests or zero insects in your landscape. So that's something for you to know, but it's also something that you would need to communicate with your customers. If they are expecting to have zero insects in their landscape, that is a very unrealistic thing. So, and actually, if you have zero insects in your landscape, that means that you probably have a very unhealthy ecosystem. So, you want to make sure that you talk to your customers and you educate them that IPM is a better way to approach things because we're going to help to control the pests, but we're also helping to conserve our beneficial organisms. With an IPM program, typically we will use pesticides as a last resort. We're going to target the use of those pesticides to particular locations where we're finding the pests, and that can help conserve beneficial insects that are helping you manage pest populations. And the other thing with pesticides is that you want to make sure that you are using low impact or less toxic products, again, to help conserve those beneficials. Like I mentioned earlier, IPM does have multiple control strategies that it contains. So not just pesticides, we're going to talk about some other stuff that you can do. And a lot of this is going to be on the front end. We're trying to prevent those pest problems from really occurring or really occurring in high numbers. So monitoring is going to be a very important part of your IPM control program. So an important part of an IPM program is going to be inspecting properly. And when you are inspecting, you really have to get up close and personal. A lot of these insects that you're looking for as a pest are going to be very small and or in hidden locations. So you would need to go out, turn over leaves, look at the stems of the plant, maybe look at the base of the plant, pull back the mulch, take a look and see what's going on in the soil. It's also a good idea to get some sort of a hand lens if you're planning on identifying things yourself, because a lot of these insects are going to be very small and you're going to need that magnification for identifying features. If you search for a hand lens, that is going to be more expensive than if you would search for a jeweler's loupe. It's essentially the same thing, but jeweler's loupes tend to be cheaper. And you can find a jeweler's loupe like you see in the upper right-hand picture for about $10 online. And that one has not only 2 magnifications, but also a light source with it. Other monitoring tools other than a hand lens, you can get sticky traps, and there are sticky traps that come in various colors based upon what insects you are hoping to capture. And you want to make sure that you're placing those sticky traps in proper locations to capture insects. And you also want to try to reduce getting any non-target organisms on those sticky traps, such as birds and reptiles. Flushing agents are another possible monitoring tool, and that could be either a pesticide-based flushing base, like a pyrethrum of some sort, or you can use soapy water for a lot of the turf pests that will have the soap irritate the exoskeleton of the insect and drive those insects to the surface so you can see what they are. A knife or some other cutting tool is going to be helpful if you need to cut sections of turf and determine if there's anything feeding on the roots of that. And if you're not planning on identifying things yourself or you're not comfortable with that, having collection containers is going to be very helpful for you to put those samples in. That could be something as simple as a zip top bag, or you can use recycled pill bottles or even disposable little snack food containers. If you're going out at night to find nocturnal insects, a lot of the insects are going to be only active at night. You might need a flashlight. It's best to have a red cover over the flashlight so the insects aren't detecting that light source, but you can still see. And then if you have certain types of insects, a black light might come in handy, and that will help to pick up the insects because certain parts of their body are going to fluoresce or glow underneath the black light. So when you're monitoring with traps, you need to place those traps in logical places, not necessarily logical places for humans, but logical places for an insect. So where is that insect going to be? And typically when we're talking about insects and other arthropods, they like to go along edges. And so inside of a structure, that would be along a wall. It could be along the foundation of a structure on the outside, but it can also be along sidewalks, along driveways, along hoses like that are running or sprinkler irrigation systems. You also need to think about where is their food? Where is the water source? If you have water leaks, a lot of times that will draw insects in. And then the last thing is, where's the shelter? Where are they going to rest when they're not actively moving around? It may be that they're living on the plant that they're feeding on, but other insects will move down into leaf litter or into mulched areas or even fly to different areas for sheltered locations. When you are identifying things, if you are not the person identifying, you can either collect samples, which is really best if you're taking those to someone for identifying, but it's also, you can use your phone for that. If you are going to take pictures of insects, it is very important to get up close to the insect and don't be afraid to use your zoom function. Get up close, get a clear in focus picture. I get a lot of pictures for identification, and it looks like somebody took the picture of the insect from 20 feet away, and it doesn't really look like anything, and it's very difficult to identify things that way. It's also a good idea to put something in the photo that is a standardized size for a reference so we can tell how large whatever it is. A ruler or a tape measure is kind of my dream. I love when people do that because that makes it very easy for me to determine how large that is. But the other thing that most people have on their person, because not everybody carries tape measures or rulers, is a coin. So if you have some sort of a US denomination coin, you can throw that out for putting down for a size reference. Your hand, I don't know how big that is. Pencils or pens or paper clips, those are all items that I don't know how large whatever it is is going to be. So that's a little bit more difficult for me to utilize as a size reference. As far as field guides, there are a variety of field guides that are available for insects. If you just want a common one for insects that are in Texas, the Common Insects of Texas by John Abbott and Kendra Abbott is very good. But if you are elsewhere, there are multiple field guides available. I do recommend anytime that you're choosing a field guide that you go to a bookstore. I'm not saying you have to buy it at the bookstore, but go to the bookstore and kind of flip through the different field guides and see which one actually is going to work with the way that your brain works, because different field guides are laid out in different manners, and it may be that one doesn't necessarily work for you. I have a field guide that I've had since college, and that's over 30 years now. And I don't use it ever because I don't like the way that it's laid out. So it just sits on the bookshelf. So make sure that you're going to actually be able to utilize that field guide. My next advice is know why the insects are on the plant. So less than 5% of insects are considered to be pests. And so when you're looking at things on the plant, it may be that you have a beneficial, and that would be the upper right-hand picture there. That is a zealous assassin bug, and that is feeding on other insects. So that would be considered a beneficial organism and not something that we would really want to target to kill. And on the left side, we have a carpenter ant that is tending leafhopper nymphs. Those leafhopper nymphs are going to be feeding on the plant, so they're sucking plant juices, and they are going to exude or excrete a waste substance that is called honeydew, and that is a sticky, sugary, sweet substance. And essentially, they're going to trade this off with the carpenter ants, so it's kind of a mutualistic relationship for them. The ants are getting that sugary substance, and in return, they provide protection to those honeydew producing insects. So if you see a plant that has ants crawling on it, that may be a sign that you have some other sort of pest. Typically, those ants aren't causing issues themselves to the plants. They're there to get honeydew. So our first kind of grouping of our IPM strategies is going to be our cultural controls. And these are going to be modifications to normal plant care that can reduce or avoid pest problems. So these are going to typically be preventative strategies. If you remember at the beginning, I said that a lot of the IPM is going to rely on us preventing those pest problems from occurring, or those really high pest populations. So that's what we're doing here with our cultural control. We are attempting to reduce the establishment of those pests and then also reduce their survival capabilities. So the first thing that plays into that is going to be site selection. We need to make sure that we are planting plants that go in the correct place in the landscape. And that could mean full sun, in having full sun plants in full sun areas, shade plants in shade areas, but also utilizing native and adapted plants for the part of the world that you are located. So you need to look at sunlight requirements for the plants, watering requirements. And with watering requirements, we really want to try to plant plants that have similar water requirements together. That way, when you're watering in the landscape, you don't have to worry about switching things up. You also might want to take a look at the soil and see how well it drains, and then make those decisions based on those information that you're getting from those particular things. So when we're prepping our soil, this is going to help build the soil and provide those plants what they require to grow. So this is going to help improve drainage, which is going to also allow the nutrients get down into the root zone where the plants are trying to take that stuff up. So a lot of times when we're preparing soil, you might do something like adding compost, and that is going to add nutrients as well as give you more organic matter. If you're going to till or turn over the soil, that can loosen that up. And a lot of people don't like tilling the soil. It really kind of depends on what you're doing. Sometimes you need to till to break up the soil, but if the soil is already broken up, you might just want to turn it over, and that can help to expose the pests that you have in that area, and that can help to kill those. When you are selecting plants, you need to really focus in on plants that are for your part of the world. When you're using native plants or plants that are adapted to a certain space, that can reduce the chance of pests. There are also various plants that you can utilize in the landscape that might be resistant to certain types of pests. So you can do more into that if you're looking at specific things like turf or something that you're installing. So your plant selection is also going to determine your planting time. So sometimes you'll want to plant things in the spring, sometimes you want to plant things in the fall. There are sometimes with trees that you want to plant them in the winter. So make sure that you're planting things at the right time of year, because that will, again, ensure success for that plant to help it resist things later on. Watering is extremely important. They're going to need that to improve their productivity. This is where knowing how your soil drains is going to be very important. So when you want to do that, you can take a soil sample, put it in a jar with water, shake it up to agitate it, and then let it settle out. And that can kind of show you the different soil layers. And that will also give you idea of drainage. Here in Texas, we're kind of divided along I-35. If we go east of I-35, we have blackland clay that really doesn't drain anything. And then to the west of I-35, we have limestone where there's no soil and it just kind of drains down into the ground immediately. So you need to make sure that you know where you are and what your soil type is for where you're planting. So when you're watering things in, you are going to be carrying any nutrients down into the root zone for the plants to take up. So it's very important that you get that good drainage. And if you don't have good drainage, that's where you need to start building the soil. It may be that you need to bring in soil and create raised beds if you're not getting good drainage, or you can just add things in such as compost or loam or different things to build that soil up. It's really best to water in the morning or up to midday. That's going to allow that water to dry on the plant throughout the day so you don't have more fungal problems if you water in the evening. That water sits there longer on the plant, and with cooler temperatures, that can lead to fungal growth. If you are wanting to know if you need to water, you definitely need to check the moisture in the area. And you can either do that by poking your finger into the soil or using a moisture meter. And when we're talking about irrigation, that is going to be done best by using soaker hoses or drip irrigation. And that can help reduce fungal spores from splashing up onto the plant and causing further issues. But essentially, it's just more important to water your plants than worrying about what type of irrigation you have. Fertilization is another thing that plants are going to require. This is how they get their nutrients. And like I mentioned previously, they need to have good soil drainage so they can carry that nutrient down to where the roots are located. And you can use a variety of fertilizers. This is something that is kind of up to your company or up to your customers as to what they're utilizing. But just know that if you are choosing synthetic or man-made products, they're typically going to have higher nutrient content, and there are different levels of NPK. So choose one that's going to be best for that particular yard or landscape that you're using. It may be that they need to get a soil test done so you can actually tell what nutrients are specifically needed for that particular area. Sanitation is extremely important in the landscape. So this could be two ways, and that's what you're kind of seeing here. So on the left-hand side, that is sanitation of tools. So if you are cutting grass or pruning plants or pruning trees or anything like that, you need to make sure that you have some sort of a disinfectant to utilize on those tools before you go to the next plant, or especially before you go to the next landscape place. And that could be a 10% bleach solution, that could be a can of disinfectant spray, that can be disinfecting wipes. But just make sure that you are disinfecting those tools so you're not spreading diseases or insects or insect eggs to other landscapes or other parts of that landscape. The right two pictures, you see a after in the middle and then a before on the right-hand side. And this is a really important thing to do. This is removing the vegetation after things have died off in the landscape, so keeping things tidy. That is removing sources of overwintering for insects. So a lot of insects are going to overwinter maybe at the base of the plant, underneath mulch, underneath leaf litter, cracks and crevices. So if you can reduce those shelter locations for the insects, then that is going to be less insects that you'll have the following year. You also want to make sure that you are reducing weeds in the area. And that is important because those are usually the first things that we have in the season. So that's typically where our insect populations start off. So when you are dealing with weeds, if you're reducing those, that's less insects that you'll have moving into that landscape later on. And if you are working to remove vegetation, it's always a good idea to wear gloves in case you encounter an insect that can bite or sting. Spacing is very important when you are installing different landscapes. This is going to allow airflow, and it can also reduce diseases and insects from transferring from plant to plant. So a lot of times, if you have things kind of trailing over the landscape, flat over the ground with ivies and things like that, that can lead to a buildup of pests because that's a good shelter location or a good place for them to hide. So you can put in trellises and have those go upward, and that can reduce that, but increase the space that you have for those plants in the landscape. When you are planning landscapes, you need to make sure that you're planning for the mature size of whatever it is that you're planting. A lot of times people will put in the smaller plants that are going to grow, and they tend to cram things together too much. And later on, when we go a year or two down the road, when things are mature, it's going to be problematic because things are crammed in too close together. Our next grouping of IPM strategies are going to be mechanical and physical control. This is my favorite category. And this is using labor, materials, and machinery to reduce your pest problems. So if you've ever stepped on a bug or used a fly swatter or newspaper or something to squish a bug, you have done mechanical control. That is essentially what you're doing. So this is going to be something that kills the pests directly, or it can keep them from getting to the plants. And when we're looking at physical control, that is going to be altering things like light, humidity, and temperature. So our first one is using mulch. So this can help prevent water loss through evaporation. It also will help with reducing the growth of weeds. It maintains the soil temperature. And then this can also be something that can help prevent splashing those fungal spores from the ground up onto the plants. As that mulch breaks down, if you're using something that is a natural mulch, then that will help to introduce organic matter into the soil, and it can improve your soil structure over time, which will then lead to improved water and nutrient movement through the soil. Vacuuming and hand picking is a great way to reduce a large pest population very quickly. Hand picking might not necessarily be the most time effective, but it really depends on how much space you're talking about. A handheld vacuum, on the other hand, is a great thing to keep with you because that can reduce populations very rapidly, and it's fairly easy to do. So if you are hand picking, you again want to wear gloves because some of these insects are capable of stinging or others are capable of biting you. So you definitely, or if you're talking about stink bugs or something, they have scent glands that they can then spray on your hand and it can stain your hand and cause it to smell. And that can be kind of difficult to remove. So if you're hand picking, wear gloves, and then you can either use a bucket of soapy water to put those insects in, or you can use a jar with rubbing alcohol. You want at least 70% isopropyl alcohol, and that's what you see in the jar on the right-hand side picture. The left-hand picture is using a handheld vacuum to reduce insect pests that are on a plant. And these are going to be obviously for smaller type insects. You're not going to be able to use this on like a big caterpillar or a full-grown grasshopper because they're not going to fit. But you want a dedicated vacuum that is specifically for the landscape use. And having either a handheld version or a backpack version is going to be easier for you to handle or utilize. And then you also want something that is cordless. So when you are using a vacuum, you essentially just turn it on, vacuum the insects off of the plant. And if any of them are still alive in the canister, you can dump those into a bucket of soapy water to kill them. But if you have a large population of something in a particular area of the landscape, it's a really quick way to reduce that. And if you want, you can then follow that up with a pesticide treatment to get any stragglers. High pressure water sprays are going to be best used against insects that are small and soft bodied. So things like aphids, whiteflies, leafhoppers, mealybugs, scale insects, all of those kind of plant parasitic insects. And since we are not applying any pesticide, there is going to be no resistance to this. So these are going to damage the exoskeleton of those small soft-bodied insects, and it will also knock them off the host plant. So while you may not necessarily kill all of the insects, you are going to be able to reduce the population, and a lot of times that is enough to allow other predators and parasitoids to come in to help manage those insects that are left. So this strategy, while you can use it against immature insects as well, because those aren't going to have wings, they are not going to work well on adult insects because those are going to be larger and they're capable of flying. So if you see an insect and it can fly around, that is an adult insect. And water sprays typically don't work on those because they can just fly away from whatever you're trying to do to them. And so it's not the best strategy for them. But if you're doing your monitoring, then that's going to allow you to catch those insects when they are in that immature stage. And so this could be a tactic that you utilize in an IPM program. Biological control may not necessarily be something that you do directly in landscapes, but this is what we are trying to help control or encourage when we're using IPM. So there are three basic types of IPM. We have conservation, where you are conserving those beneficial insects that are in the environment. We have augmentation, which is where you would purchase something and release it into the environment to control other organisms. Or we have classical or importation, and that's usually universities and governmental agencies where they go to other countries to find predators and parasitoids of non-native species and bring those back to help manage. But those are very long, research intensive programs before they release those into the environment. So mainly when we're talking about people using biological control in the environment, it is going to be more targeted towards conservation, where we are hoping that you target your treatments, you're using IPM strategies so we can conserve those beneficial organisms that we find already in the environment that are helping to manage those pest populations. And then the last big section in IPM, if you remember way back from the beginning, pesticides are typically going to be a last resort in an IPM program. So pesticides do play into the program, but we want to not reach for those first because we want to conserve those beneficial organisms. So when we're looking at chemical terminology, the active ingredient is going to be the most important thing that you can really look at on the label, because that is going to tell you what is going to kill the pest that is in that product. So when you're looking at it, just know the active ingredient may be repeated, but the products are going to have different trade names because multiple people will use similar active ingredients like bifenthrin or lambdocyhalothrin or carbaryl or malathion or different things like that. So those are all active ingredients, but those may have different trade names. The formulation is something that you also need to pay attention to. Is it a dust, a spray? Is it a granular that needs to be watered in? Is it a bait that is essentially a food for the insect and it shouldn't get wet? That formulation is also going to tell you what equipment that you might need to apply that pesticide. And then you also need to communicate with the customer what they need to do to help you when you're doing those treatments. So if you are putting out a granular product, tell that customer, communicate with them that they need to water that in, because if they don't water it in and it doesn't rain, then it's just going to sit there and it's not going to control anything because that granular product isn't dissolving and getting carried down into the soil. So make sure that you are communicating with your customer. Anytime that you are using a pesticide, you need to make sure that you are using it according to the labeled instructions. So regardless of how many times that you have used a pesticide previously, you always need to read and follow those labeled instructions. So when you're choosing a pesticide, try to choose a targeted pesticide if you can. So a low impact that is going to not affect those beneficials. And that could be something like Bacillus thuringiensis kursaki. That is a product that's only going to affect caterpillars. You also want to try to target your treatment area. If you have problems on one plant in the landscape, treat that plant. You don't have to necessarily treat everything in the whole entire landscape. And then also know your rules and regulations for your state. For the state that I am in, Texas is a site state. So it is important that site that you are treating has to be on the product label. But also know that product label is going to give you all of the information that you require to be able to utilize it. It's going to tell you where you can use that product. Is it a tree product? Is it able to be used on fruits or vegetables or trees that are nut bearing? Is it a turf product? Is it something that could be used on golf courses? So just make sure that you're reading that label. It's also going to give you the active ingredient. It's going to give you equipment that you need to apply it. It's going to put how you can store it. What happens if something gets in your eye? Everything that you need is on that label. So make sure that you have the label on your product and that you are reading it before you utilize it. The other thing that I want to stress, all pesticides are meant to kill. That's what the CIDE part means. That means to kill. So always make sure that you are using your PPE when you are using pesticides. That will also be on the product label. What personal protective equipment do you need to use while you're putting that on? Usually that's going to be long sleeve, long pants, possibly safety glasses of some sort when you're mixing it. Make sure that you have pesticide resistant boots. You might want to wear pesticide resistant gloves. So just, again, check that label and figure out what you need to keep yourself safe. So our low impact pesticide options, the first one is our insect growth regulators. These are products that are going to mimic hormones that only arthropods have. So these are a lot of things that are in bait products. And so they're going to be out there for managing ants or cockroaches or sometimes termites if you do termite work. Our next category are our microbials, and probably the most commonly used there is a BT or the Bacillus thuringiensis products. Those are going to be different formulations or different varieties depending on what type of insect you're trying to manage. The two most common are BT Kerstocki, which targets caterpillars. It does not target only caterpillars that people don't want in their landscape, but if you have someone who has a butterfly garden, it can also kill those caterpillars. So again, you need to make sure that you are targeting the correct area, even if you're using a low impact product. The other BT product that is very commonly used is the BT Israeliensis products. Those are used in standing water to manage things like mosquito larvae, black fly larvae, and midge larvae. Some of our naturally derived contact products are things like insecticidal soaps. We have our botanicals, which are derived from plants. And even though these are naturally derived, these are both broad spectrum products. They are going to degrade fairly rapidly in the environment, so they don't stick around for a very long time, but they will kill both beneficial insects as well as the pest insects. So again, if you're trying to conserve those beneficials, you need to target your treatments. So if you're interested in more information or if you have questions about arthropods or control, you have my contact information. It's best to email me. And if you are on social media and want more information on insects, you can follow me on Facebook or Instagram. And then we also have a podcast that we do. You can stream that from any podcast platform, streaming service that you choose. And that is called Bugs by the Yard, where we talk about a variety of insects in the landscape.